12 cents a day was not a figure written down in ledgers or announced with certainty. It lived instead in pockets, in tired hands, and in the quiet calculations people made while standing in narrow streets. In 1800s New York, this small sum shaped entire lives. It decided what could be eaten, how often hunger would be ignored, and how long strength might last. Food was not a pleasure or a ritual. It was a question asked every morning with no guaranteed answer. For many poor families, breakfast was not a meal but a pause. A cup of weak tea or coffee made from reused grounds might be shared between adults. Sometimes there was bread, often stale, sometimes softened with water to make it easier to chew. Butter was rare. Milk spoiled quickly and was expensive, so it appeared only when absolutely necessary, usually for children. Adults learned to quiet their hunger early in the day, saving their strength for long hours of labor. Bread was the foundation of survival. Cheap loaves made from low-quality flour filled the stomach even when they offered little comfort. Bakers stretched ingredients as far as possible, and buyers rarely asked questions. A loaf might be dense, sour, or oddly colored, but it was still food. People learned which shops sold the heaviest bread for the lowest price. A few pennies saved on bread meant another meal later in the week. By midday, those who worked outside the home often carried their food with them. Lunch might be a thick slice of bread folded around nothing at all. If fortune allowed, there could be a smear of lard or a thin piece of cheese. Meat was not common. When it appeared, it was usually salted pork, cheap and heavy with fat. The salt preserved it but also made it harsh, so it was eaten slowly with water to soften its bite. Street food existed, but it was not always affordable. Vendors sold boiled potatoes, roasted corn, or cheap pies with unknown fillings. The poor watched carefully, calculating whether the cost was worth the fullness it promised. A potato, plain and warm, could feel like a luxury when eaten standing on a cold sidewalk. Even so, many chose to wait, holding onto their coins for something more filling later. Dinner, when it happened, was the most important meal of the day. It was usually eaten at home, in crowded rooms shared with family or strangers. A pot might sit over a small fire, simmering whatever could be afforded. Potatoes were common, filling and reliable. Cabbage appeared often, boiled until soft, losing its sharpness and becoming gentle and bland. On rare days, a small piece of meat flavored the entire pot, its presence more symbolic than substantial. Soup was a clever solution to constant scarcity. Bones bought cheaply from butchers added flavor even when they offered little nutrition. Water stretched ingredients further, allowing a single onion or carrot to serve many mouths. Soup also warmed the body, which mattered deeply during long winters when fuel was as scarce as food. People learned to value warmth as much as taste. Children learned hunger early. They understood that food came in portions and that asking for more was not always possible. Parents often ate less so that children could eat more, pushing bread towards small hands with practiced smiles. This quiet sacrifice was common and rarely spoken of. Hunger became part of family life, shared but unevenly carried. Markets were places of careful observation rather than abundance. The poor arrived late, when prices dropped and leftovers remained. Bruised vegetables, overripe fruit, and cuts of meat others had rejected were gathered with gratitude. Nothing was wasted. Even peels and scraps were saved, boiled, or dried for later use. Cooking was not about creativity, but about endurance. Water was not always clean, which affected food in subtle ways. Drinks were often watered-down beer or tea, believed to be safer than plain water. These drinks added little nourishment, but helped fill the stomach. Sugar was expensive, so sweetness was rare and memorable. A spoonful of molasses could transform a dull meal into something comforting, even if only briefly. 12 cents did not buy variety. Meals repeated themselves day after day until flavors blurred together. Yet people developed preferences within limits. Some favored potatoes over bread, others preferred cabbage despite its smell. Small choices helped maintain a sense of control. Eating the same food daily could still feel personal if prepared in a familiar way. Cooking spaces were small and poorly equipped. A single pot, a dull knife, and a shared fire were enough. Meals were eaten quickly, often in silence, not out of sadness but habit. Energy was preserved for work, not conversation. The body learned efficiency, both in movement and in consumption. Despite scarcity, there were moments of quiet satisfaction. A full stomach, even briefly, brought calm. Sitting after a meal, feeling warmth spread slowly through tired limbs was one of the few comforts consistently available. Food did not bring joy in grand ways, but it offered steadiness, a rhythm that marked the passing of days. 12 cents a day did not promise health or happiness. It promised survival, negotiated meal by meal. The poor of 1800s New York did not eat to explore flavors or traditions. They ate to endure. In that endurance, food became something deeper than nourishment. It became a quiet companion, modest and repetitive, but essential in carrying people through another ordinary day. Morning arrived quietly in the tenement rooms of 1800s New York. There were no alarms, no clocks announcing the hour. People woke instead to sound and habit, the shuffle of feet in the hallway, the creak of floorboards above, the low cough of a neighbor already awake. Light entered slowly, filtered through narrow windows coated with dust and soot, never quite bright, never fully dark. The room itself served many purposes. It was a bedroom, a kitchen, and a living space all at once. Families slept close together, bodies arranged carefully to fit the limited floor space. Mattresses were thin or absent, replaced by straw-filled sacks or folded blankets. When morning came, bedding was rolled or stacked to make room for the day. This small act of rearranging marked the transition from rest to labor. Air in the tenement was heavy, especially in warmer months. Windows were opened when possible, though they looked out onto brick walls or crowded courtyards rather than open streets. Smells lingered: cooked cabbage from the night before, damp clothing, smoke from nearby fires. These scents blended into something familiar, no longer noticed, part of the background of daily life. Breakfast was simple, and often shared in silence. If bread remained from the previous day, it was divided carefully. Crusts were valued as much as soft pieces, sometimes more, because they lasted longer. Tea or coffee, weak and pale, warmed hands more than it satisfied hunger. Cups were chipped, mismatched, and reused endlessly, rinsed quickly and set aside. Children woke early, accustomed to the rhythm of the room. Some were already expected to work, delivering goods or assisting in workshops. Others stayed behind, helping with small tasks. Washing was brief and cold, done with water carried from communal pumps. Faces were wiped, hair smoothed, and clothing shaken free of dust. Cleanliness was limited by access, not by desire. The tenement walls were thin. Voices carried easily, creating a sense of constant presence. Neighbours argued softly, laughed briefly, or exchanged greetings through open doors. Privacy was rare, but familiarity grew from proximity. People recognized footsteps and voices, learning who rose early and who lingered. Morning revealed these patterns day after day. Cooking fires were small and carefully managed. Fuel was expensive, so flames were kept low. A single pot might be set on the stove, filled with water to reheat leftovers or soften bread. There was no rush to cook elaborate meals. Efficiency mattered more than taste. The goal was warmth and sustenance, nothing more. Clothing chosen in the morning was practical. Garments were worn repeatedly until repair was unavoidable. Layers were added or removed based on the season, not fashion. Shoes were slipped on carefully, soles already thin, laces frayed. Each item was treated with care because replacement was uncertain. As morning progressed, the building stirred fully awake. Doors opened and closed, footsteps echoed down stairwells, and the faint sound of street life drifted upward. Carts rattled over cobblestones, vendors called out, and distant factory whistles marked time more reliably than clocks. These sounds signaled departure. Work awaited, and delays were not tolerated. Those who stayed behind began their own routines, washing clothes in shared basins, mending torn fabric, or preparing food for later hours. The tenement room shifted again, adapting to day's needs. Children practiced quiet games in corners, aware of limited space. Adults moved carefully, avoiding unnecessary steps. Light changed slowly inside the room. Morning sun rarely reached far, but its presence was felt in subtle ways. Shadows shifted along the walls, and dust floated visibly for a few moments before settling again. These small changes were noticed by those who spent long hours indoors. Time was measured by light, sound, and hunger rather than by minutes. Despite hardship, mornings were not always heavy with despair. There was comfort in routine, in knowing what came next. The repetition of actions, folding blankets, pouring tea, tying shoes, created stability. Even in uncertainty, these small rituals offered grounding. The tenement room held many lives within its walls, each morning adding another layer of memory. Scratches on the floor, marks on the wall, and worn patches on fabric told stories without words. These signs were not hidden, they were accepted part of living closely and constantly. As people stepped out into the day, the room briefly rested, fires cooled, sounds faded, and light settled into stillness. Yet it was never truly empty. It waited, patient and unchanged, ready to receive its occupants again when evening returned. Morning in a tenement room was not about beginnings or endings. It was simply another quiet passage through a life shaped by shared space, limited means, and steady endurance. Hunger in 1800s New York was not always loud. It did not arrive suddenly or announce itself with pain. More often, it settled in slowly, becoming a familiar presence that shaped thought and behavior. Bread and tea were the tools used to manage it. Together, they formed a quiet system of calculation, a daily mathematics practiced without paper or pencil. Bread was measured not just by size, but by how long it could last. A loaf was examined carefully, its weight tested in the hand. Dense bread meant fuller stomachs and fewer complaints. Slices were cut evenly, sometimes thinner than desired, so that the loaf could stretch across several meals. Each cut represented a choice made in advance, a small sacrifice traded for future security. Tea played a different role. It was rarely strong. Leaves were used once, then again, sometimes a third time, until the water carried only a faint colour. Yet even weak tea served a purpose. Warmth softened hunger, at least for a while. Holding a cup, feeling heat travel through cold fingers, offered comfort beyond nourishment. Tea slowed the day, giving the body something to process when food was scarce. Sugar was added sparingly, if at all. A small spoonful could lift spirits, but it shortened supply. Many learned to drink tea plain, accepting bitterness as normal. Children were sometimes given slightly sweeter cups, a quiet attempt to make hunger easier for them to bear. Adults adapted, training themselves to find satisfaction in warmth alone. The math of hunger began early each morning. How much bread remained? How many mouths needed feeding? How many hours of work lay ahead? These questions guided decisions without discussion. A larger portion might be given to someone facing heavy labor, while others quietly accepted less. Fairness was adjusted constantly, shaped by need rather than equality. Leftovers were never wasted. Crusts were saved, sometimes dried and soaked later. Stale bread was softened in tea or water, becoming easier to eat and less likely to be refused. Nothing was thrown away unless it posed real danger. Hunger taught efficiency, and efficiency became instinct. Tea breaks, when possible, created pauses in long days. They were moments of stillness, brief chances to rest without spending money. Sitting with a cup allowed time to pass gently, reducing the urgency of hunger. Even when the stomach remained empty, the ritual itself brought calm. Children learned these calculations by watching. They observed how slices were cut, how cups were filled, how adults delayed eating until later. Hunger education was informal but effective. By a young age, many understood the value of waiting, of not asking, of making do. Markets and shops reinforced this careful thinking. Prices were memorized, compared, and remembered. A penny saved on tea meant more bread later. A cheaper loaf might be smaller, forcing adjustments elsewhere. Every purchase had consequences that extended beyond the moment. Bread and tea also shaped social interactions. Sharing a loaf signaled trust. Offering tea, even weak, was a gesture of kindness. Hospitality existed within limits, expressed through what little could be spared. These exchanges built quiet bonds among people facing similar struggles. Evening hunger was often the hardest. After long hours of work, the body demanded more than bread and tea could offer, yet many chose restraint, saving portions for the next morning. Going to sleep slightly hungry was common, accepted as part of planning rather than fail. The body adapted in subtle ways. Hunger became predictable, arriving at certain hours, easing after warm drinks, returning by night. People learned their own rhythms, adjusting portions accordingly. This awareness allowed survival, though it rarely allowed comfort. Bread, tea, and the math of hunger formed a daily equation with no perfect solution. The balance was fragile, easily disrupted by illness, lost work, or rising prices. Yet day after day the calculation was repeated. It required patience, discipline, and a quiet acceptance of limits. In this system, food was not about satisfaction, but about strategy. Bread filled, tea soothed, and hunger was managed rather than defeated. Through this careful arithmetic, the poor carried themselves forward, one measured bite and one warm cup at a time. In 1800s New York, the word cheap did not always mean affordable. Food labelled as inexpensive still carried a cost that many could not manage without sacrifice. Prices were small on paper, measured in cents, but those cents were already assigned in the quiet budgets of survival. Even the least costly foods demanded careful thought before they could be bought. Markets displayed options that seemed within reach. Potatoes piled high, bread stacked in baskets, scraps of meat laid out at the edge of butcher stalls. To someone with steady wages, these items were minor purchases. To the poor, they represented decisions that would echo across days. Buying one thing often meant giving up another, and the balance was never simple. Potatoes were among the cheapest foods available, yet even they could feel expensive. A few pounds might feed a family for a day, but only if nothing went wrong. Spoilage was common. A bag that looked sound in the market could reveal rot by evening. Money spent on unusable food was money lost entirely, and such losses carried weight far beyond the moment. Bread, though central to daily life, was not always reliable. Prices shifted with grain supplies, and demand. A rise of a single cent forced immediate changes. Portions were cut thinner, meals skipped, or cheaper alternatives sought. The instability of bread prices made planning difficult, keeping families in a constant state of adjustment. Meat was the clearest example of cheap food being out of reach. Cuts sold to the poor were tough, fatty, and often near spoilage. They required long cooking and extra fuel, which added to their true cost. A piece of salted pork might be affordable at the counter, but expensive once firewood or coal was considered. Sometimes it was cheaper to go without. Milk was another risk. It spoiled quickly and was often diluted before sale. For families with children it was necessary, but it came with uncertainty. Paying for milk that turned sour by midday meant hunger later. This risk made many hesitant, choosing safer foods even if they offered less nourishment. Street food appeared tempting, especially during long workdays. A hot pie or boiled core offered immediate relief from hunger. Yet these foods consumed coins quickly and left little behind. What filled the stomach for an hour could reduce dinner later. Many learned to walk past vendors, resisting warmth for the sake of endurance. Fuel costs shaped food choices as much as prices did. Foods that required long cooking were avoided when possible. Boiling bones for soup stretched ingredients but demanded time and heat. When fuel was scarce, even cheap ingredients became impractical. Cold meals, though less satisfying, often won. The poor understood value differently than those with means. They calculated not only price but risk. Could the food spoil? Would it require extra fuel? Would it last more than one meal? These questions mattered as much as cost. Cheap food that failed any of these tests was too expensive to justify. Markets also carried pressure and temptation. Seeing food displayed openly sharpened hunger. Choosing not to buy required restraint learned through repetition. Walking away from food was sometimes the wiser decision, though it felt unnatural. This restraint was part of survival, practiced daily. Children felt these decisions indirectly. Meals varied depending on what could be afforded safely. Some days were fuller than others, not because of income changes, but because risk had been avoided or taken. Parents shielded children from the calculations, presenting outcomes without explanation. When cheap food became too expensive, families adapted quietly. They ate less, waited longer, and relied more heavily on the simplest staples. Variety disappeared, replaced by repetition. This narrowing of diet was not a choice but a response to constant uncertainty. In this environment, affordability was fragile. It depended on more than price tags. It rested on stability, reliability, and the ability to turn food into nourishment without loss. When these conditions failed, even the cheapest food slipped out of reach, leaving hunger to be managed in other ways. Women in 1800s New York carried hunger quietly, often as part of their work rather than apart from it. Their days were long and divided, shaped by labor that was constant and rarely recognized. Food was one more responsibility to manage, even when there was little of it. Empty plates were not always signs of scarcity alone, but of choices made to keep households moving forward. Many women worked from home, taking in sewing, laundry, or piecework that paid by completion rather than by hour. This kind of labor demanded patience and precision, often performed while tending children or managing the household. Meals were fitted into pauses, not planned breaks. Eating happened quickly, sometimes standing, sometimes delayed until work was finished. For women who worked outside the home, time was even more limited. Domestic servants, factory workers and cleaners left early and returned late. Their meals were often cold and simple, carried in pockets or wrapped in cloth. Bread was omom, sometimes accompanied by a bit of fat or a boiled potato. Hunger followed them through the day, quiet but persistent. Cooking, when possible, was done with efficiency rather than care. Women learned which foods could be prepared quickly and stretched easily. Soup was favoured because it fed many and required little attention once simmering. Bread was cut thin, portions managed carefully. Plates were filled with intention, not abundance. Mothers often ate last. This was not spoken of as sacrifice, but it was understood. Children and working men were given priority, their needs seen as more immediate. Women adjusted their own portions accordingly, learning to function on less. Over time, this became habit rather than hardship, woven into daily routine. Empty plates appeared often, especially at the end of the day. They were not always literal, but they reflected the limits of supply. A pot scraped clean, crumbs gathered, cups drained of their last warmth. These moments were met with acceptance rather than complaint. Tomorrow would require the same effort, and energy was conserved where possible. Work shaped hunger in subtle ways. Physical labor increased appetite, but meals did not expand to match it. Women learned to pace themselves, conserving strength through controlled movement and measured eating. Rest was rare, and food became a tool for endurance rather than satisfaction. In shared living spaces, women often coordinated meals with others. Cooking together reduced fuel costs and saved time. Responsibilities were divided, but food remained central to cooperation. Sharing was practical, not sentimental, though it built quiet connections among those involved. Markets and shops were usually visited by women who memorized prices and patterns. They knew which vendors were reliable and which foods carried risk. This knowledge was passed along casually, through conversation and observation. It was part of the invisible labor that kept households functioning despite constant effort. Women rarely described themselves as hungry. The language of hunger was reserved for children or illness. For themselves they spoke instead of being tired. Fatigue became the acceptable expression of need, masking hunger beneath it. Clothing grew loose, energy faded, but work continued. Women adjusted without pause, their bodies adapting to limited nourishment. These changes were noticed privately, rarely discussed. Survival required focus, not reflection. Yet within this quiet endurance there were moments of care. A slightly larger portion for a sick child, a saved crust for later, a warm cup of tea at night. These small acts mattered. They represented attention in a life shaped by scarcity. Women, work, and empty plates formed a daily pattern. Hunger did not stop labor, and labor did not guarantee food. Still, through persistence and careful management, households endured. The empty plate was not an ending, but part of a cycle repeated each day, carried forward by steady hands and quiet resolve. In the crowded neighborhoods of 1800s New York, survival depended on more than wages or luck. It depended on ingenuity, on the ability to see possibility where resources were thin. People learned to adapt not because they wished to, but because daily life required it. Out of this necessity grew habits that were practical, shared, and quietly dignified. Ingenuity showed itself in small, ordinary ways. A cracked pot was repaired with wire rather than discarded. A worn coat was turned inside out to hide frayed fabric. Food scraps became ingredients, not waste. Onion skins flavored broth, breadcrumbs thickened soup, and bones simmered until nothing more could be taken from them. These acts were not celebrated. They were simply understood as sensible. Community made this ingenuity stronger. Neighbors watched one another closely, not out of curiosity but awareness. If someone fell ill, food might appear at their door without explanation. If work ran short, names were shared quietly, pointing toward opportunities however small. Help rarely came with words. It arrived through action, preserving pride on both sides. Shared spaces encouraged cooperation. In tenements, kitchens were small and fuel expensive. Cooking together reduced costs and effort. One fire served many pots. One trip to the market supplied several households. These arrangements shifted often, forming and dissolving as circumstances changed. Flexibility was valued more than structure. Children learned community early. They carried messages, shared errands, and passed food between rooms. Through these tasks, they absorbed unspoken rules about respect and restraint, taking only what was offered, returning what was borrowed, and saying little about what one lacked were lessons learned by watching rather than instruction. Ingenuity extended beyond food and shelter. Clothing was exchanged, repaired and resized as bodies grew or weakened. Shoes passed from one wearer to the next. Tea, soles replaced, laces improvised. Nothing useful was truly owned by one person alone. Possession was temporary, guided by need. Work skills were shared freely. A woman who knew how to stretch flour taught another. A man skilled in repair fixed tools for neighbors in exchange for favors rather than money. Knowledge moved through these communities like currency, filling gaps where cash could not. Despite hardship, dignity remained central. People took care in their appearance when possible, smoothing clothing and washing faces before stepping outside. These gestures mattered. They were declarations of self-respect in a world that often denied it. Dignity was not loud or defiant, it was steady and personal. Charity existed, but it was approached carefully. Accepting help carried risk to pride and reputation. Many preferred mutual aid to formal charity, where balance could be maintained. Giving and receiving were part of an ongoing exchange rather than a one-sided act. This balance protected dignity on both sides. Silence played a role in maintaining respect. Suffering was rarely announced. Complaints were kept brief or unspoken. This was not because pain was absent, but because attention was focused on what could be done. Dwelling on hardship offered little advantage. Action, however small, felt more useful. Celebrations were modest but meaningful. A shared meal on a rare day of extra earnings, a warm fire during winter evenings, or a moment of laughter in a crowded room provided relief. These moments did not erase hardship, but they softened it. They reminded people that life held more than endurance alone. Faith, in many forms, supported quiet dignity. Some found comfort in churches, others in personal rituals practiced at home. Prayer, reflection, or simple moments of stillness helped people frame their struggles within something larger. This inner life did not require resources, only time and intention. Community also provided boundaries. Gossip was restrained. Judgment softened by shared experience. People understood that circumstances shifted quickly. Today's helper could be tomorrow's recipient. This awareness encouraged empathy and reduced cruelty. Ingenuity, community, and quiet dignity formed a system as important as any wage or ration. They filled gaps left by scarcity, offering structure where none was guaranteed. Through shared effort and careful restraint, people preserved not just life but identity. These qualities did not eliminate hunger or hardship. They made them bearable. They allowed individuals to move through difficult days without losing themselves entirely. In this balance of effort and support, life continued, not easily but steadily, held together by human connection and the determination to remain whole. The meals eaten by the poor in 1800s New York were never just about food. On the surface they appeared simple and repetitive, built from bread, potatoes, tea, and occasional scraps. But beneath this simplicity lived meaning shaped by circumstance. Each meal carried weight beyond nourishment, reflecting choices, limits, and the quiet effort to remain human in difficult conditions. Food measured stability. A full pot, even a modest one, signaled a day without immediate crisis. An empty cupboard brought unease that extended beyond hunger. Meals acted as markers of control in lives where much felt uncertain. Being able to prepare something, anything, gave shape to the day and reassured people that survival remained within reach. These meals also represented time. They reflected hours spent working, walking, waiting, and enduring. Bread eaten at night held the labor of the day within it. Soup simmered slowly mirrored the pace of lives that required patience. Eating was one of the few moments when the body could pause, even briefly, and recognize its own effort. Sharing food carried meaning of its own. Dividing a loaf or offering a cup of tea signaled trust and belonging. These gestures were small, but powerful, especially in crowded spaces where privacy was limited. To share food was to acknowledge another person's presence and struggle without needing words. Meals taught restraint. Portions were controlled, not because appetite was absent, but because foresight was necessary. Learning when to stop eating, even when hungry, was a skill developed over time. This restraint shaped character as much as habit, reinforcing patience and awareness of consequence. For children, these meals became lessons. They learned that food was earned, managed, and respected. Waste was unthinkable, not out of moral teaching, but experience. These early lessons followed them into adulthood, shaping how they understood security and care. Meals also carried memory. The repetition of flavors created familiarity, and familiarity became comfort. Even bland foods held meaning when they were reliable. The smell of boiled potatoes or weak tea could calm anxiety, reminding people of routines that had sustained them before. Hunger, though present, was not always the dominant feeling. Often it was overshadowed by fatigue or focus on work. Meals helped manage hunger rather than erase it. This management allowed people to function. to keep moving forward despite limitations. Food marked relationships within households. Who ate first, who ate last, who received the largest portion, all reflected roles and responsibilities. These patterns were rarely discussed but deeply understood. Meals reinforced family structure, sometimes gently, sometimes with quiet tension. Even the absence of food carried meaning. Skipped meals signaled caution, preparation, or sacrifice. They were decisions made with intention, not accidents. Going without was part of planning, a way to protect future days at the cost of present comfort. Over time, these meals shaped identity. People learned to see themselves as capable, adaptable, and resilient, surviving on little required skill and awareness. This self-understanding mattered, especially in a society that often measured worth by wealth. The simplicity of these meals also revealed inequality. What was considered adequate for the poor would have been unacceptable to others. Yet within this imbalance, people carved out their own standards of sufficiency. Enough was redefined, grounded in reality rather than comparison. Ultimately, these meals meant continuity. They allowed life to proceed from one day to the next. They did not promise improvement, but they supported endurance. In a world of limited choices, food became a quiet anchor. These meals were not remembered for taste or abundance. They were remembered for what they made possible. Through them, people sustained not only their bodies, but their routines, relationships, and sense of self. In that way, food became more than sustenance. It became a form of steady, unspoken resilience.